Hello, today's Bible study comes from 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, verses 1 through 6, and it reads as follows. Now for the matters you wrote about. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self control. I say this is as a concession, not as a command. Amen. Paul is sitting here answering specific questions to the letters that he had received from the Corinthians, and he is starting it off, and he says it right there. And if you read in the King James Version, I like both versions, but King James is a little stronger here, so I might go to King James. But it says, now for the matters you wrote to me about. Okay, about the questions and the specific questions, really, that you wrote to me about. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Well, the Lord expects us to have that within the marriage, not outside of the marriage. So it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman if they are not married. But Paul says, as he goes on, he says, um, yeah, you understand that. And it is good. And if you read King James, and that's why I like it here, it says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman and still having sex with her. But it was mainly because Paul was agreeing with the Corinthians when they said this. Um, but there's a but here. Because they're not saying complete celibacy. Um, uh, they're not even thinking that. They're not giving it up, abstaining from every woman. That's not what you're saying here. Um, but this sexual immorality that we spoke in chapter 6 that we were told to flee from, it is dangerous. And if you abstain from um, having sex altogether, even in marriage, they thought it would make you holier. It does not make you holier. That's not what Paul was trying to tell them. And marriage is not a less holy place. It's not. It's not a um, celibacy is not higher than um, marriage when you have sex, and vice versa. Um, because if you really think about it, it really says that we need to part in marriage, but that's not what it says. So it says, nevertheless, Paul says, but let me tell you what really is going on. Nevertheless, because of sexual morality, now see, there's that sexual morality. Because of that, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband, because sex is accepted in a marriage. And Paul tells them that sexual morality, because of it that's going on over here right now, um, there are some things that should not be occurring. So he says, because of that, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And there was a problem with this sexual morality over there. And you can tell that just by the goddess that they worshiped and what we had spoken of in the end of chapter 6. Um, it is appropriate and allowed for the man and the woman to have each other in a sexual nature in a marriage. We know of this throughout the history of the Bible. We've been told this. But Paul ain't saying, hey, y'all go out and get married so you can have sex. I don't want y'all to think that's the only reason why you get married. And Paul is, he talks about that later on, but Uh, Paul is saying that you should have sexual relations in your marriage, husbands and wives. Now, if you're in the marriage and you think you're shortchanging or whatever, Paul's going to address that because this relationship is just not physical, and I don't want you to think that's physical because you can have this lack of in your marriage, and it says, nevertheless, because of sexual morality, sex is not the only reason for marriage. It's not even the main reason for marriage. It's not the most important reason for marriage. Paul is just addressing a question that they ask, a specific question about marriage. And he doesn't go into it in big detail, but you can see it detail in other books. So just keep reading your word, you'll see it. But then he gets to what what you could call the responsibility between both parties in the marriage. Um, he says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. Um, this is a time where a man must touch. And I like the fact that Paul uses affection because affection is more than just sex. There are things that go with affection. And Paul says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. Um, in other words, you can't withhold affection from your wife, just like she can't hold affection from you. Not for punishment, not to be spiteful, not to be mean. Um, but Paul takes the time here and he tells you, um, the woman needs and has her needs, and they're not just sexual, just like men have needs. And unbeknownst to most brains, they're not just sexual. Men may not want to say that, but men need to be cuddled and held and secured and have their ego stroked and all those same things that women do. Maybe not to the extreme, but then it depends on the man and the woman because some are on the opposite side of it. And this affection is due. Uh-oh. And don't forget, if you are having sexual relations in your marriage, but there is no affection, you are cheating your spouse. Um, and you don't want to cheat them. It's due. And this affection is not just for physical affection, you know, because there'll be a time when we can't physically do things prayerfully, Lord, but I hope not. But as you age, as things happen, as things change. And the affection really addresses change because you may not be able to have a intimate intercourse sexual relationship, but you can still hold the hand, you can still smile, you can still listen, you can still cuddle, you can still talk, you can still do things together. They can feel secure just knowing that you are there. Where your physical parts may lack, or as you age and things just go the way of nature. So I love the word affection here. And then Paul says the same is for the husband. Don't think we leave out the husband. So we render to our wife, and and instead of us thinking that the woman owes us, we owe her. We have to give to her, and you have to understand that it's due. It's due. It's owed. The wife does not have authority over her own body. In short, they're saying her body does not belong to her, but to the husband. And ladies, it's the same for the husband belongs to you, to his wife. And that doesn't mean we get to do crazy things to you and vice versa. Um, and that's sexually or otherwise, any other way. We just have an obligation to serve with genuine physical affection. Okay. Do not deprive one another. Paul says, and he's putting here, and he just doesn't believe that the idea that you as a husband and wife could be holier by sexual abstinence. That's not true. You are allowed sex in a marriage. That is allowed. The truth of the matter is, Paul thinks it could harm a marriage because you deprive one another. Things don't get fulfilled. So temptation steps in and desires and things that I want or you want step in, and guess who else walks up in the door? Mr. Satan himself. And he says, well, if you can't get it here, I'll tell you where you can get it at. And when you're denied physical affection or even the intimacy of sex, you shortchange your mate. And we have to understand that. Now, he does tell you you can do this to fast and pray, and we'll see that in a couple of verses. And in other instances, you might have to, but don't make it a long, extended amount of time because the self-control, the lack of self-control will eat you up. And that's where Satan steps in and says, I say this as a concession. You can do this for a short period of time. And he says for fasting and prayer. But it is only for a short period of time. It can't be 4-5 months unless something is physically wrong with you. And then that's where the other one has to give. But then after that, you're supposed to come together in a sexual sense. And remember, Paul is answering specific questions, okay? Now, the good thing about these first 6 verses is God is making it clear that there is nothing wrong with sex in the marriage. And Satan would love to get any chance to use that sex in either way, outside the marriage or in the marriage, to harm the marriage. Remember that. And Satan doesn't care if it goes either way. If you go outside the marriage, he doesn't care. If you abstain and you don't fulfill your partner's needs or give them the affection that they needed and they need to go elsewhere, Satan still accomplishes his goal. So he doesn't care either way. But the Lord is telling you there's nothing wrong and everything is right if it's in the marriage. Now, with that being said, when we come back tomorrow, Paul is going to talk about the single side. Amen.